It was late, around 2 a.m., the kind of silence only found in the middle of nowhere, a place where the only sounds were the chirps of crickets and the occasional rustling of the trees in the wind. I was driving down a long, desolate road, the kind where you can barely see a single light in any direction, just endless stretches of darkness, broken only by the dim headlights of my car. I had been on this road for what seemed like forever. My GPS kept telling me that I was still an hour away from my destination, but I didn't really trust it anymore. I had taken a wrong turn back in the town, and now I was completely lost. The rural backroads were tricky to navigate, and I wasn't familiar with the area at all. As I drove, my mind started to wander. I couldn't help but think of the stories I had heard about these kinds of roads, the kind of stories that people tell to scare each other around campfires. Tales of people who vanish without a trace, or of strange creatures lurking in the trees, waiting for an unsuspecting victim to wander too far off the beaten path. I wasn't superstitious, but in the middle of nowhere, things always felt off. Like the air was thicker, heavier. Maybe it was the isolation that did it, or maybe the stillness that wrapped around me like a thick, suffocating blanket. Whatever it was, I felt it in my gut. The faint hum of the engine was the only sound in the car. I checked my mirrors. Nothing. Just the black road stretching behind me. The headlights illuminated the road ahead, but I still couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. Then, the headlights flickered. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe it was just a glitch, but a few moments later, the lights went out entirely. I slammed my foot on the brake, heart racing. The car came to a halt, and I sat in the darkness, my hands gripping the steering wheel. I tried the ignition again, but nothing. The car was completely dead. Great, I muttered under my breath. Of all the places to break down, I fumbled for my phone to call for help, but of course there was no signal. This area was so remote, I wouldn't be surprised if there wasn't a cell tower for miles. I sat there for a moment, staring at the dead dashboard, trying to figure out what to do. The feeling of unease only grew, like the air had thickened even more. I couldn't sit there for long, though, so I grabbed a flashlight from my bag and stepped out of the car. The cold night air hit me instantly. I scanned my surroundings, but all I could see was endless darkness stretching in every direction. The road seemed to disappear into nothingness. The trees around me swayed in the wind, their branches creaking, but no other sounds. It was too quiet, too still. I started walking, hoping I would come across something. A house, a gas station, anything that might offer some help. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone, but there was nothing. Just the dark woods that surrounded me. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. I kept walking, my flashlight cutting through the darkness, when I suddenly heard a noise. It was faint at first, but then it grew louder, like footsteps, slow, deliberate, crunching in the dry leaves. My heart started pounding, and I froze. I scanned the trees, but there was nothing there. The footsteps stopped, dead silence. I didn't move. My eyes darted in every direction, trying to make sense of what was happening. Then I saw it. A figure, standing just at the edge of the tree line. It was tall, but hunched, its features hidden in the shadows. The figure was just standing there, watching me. I couldn't make out its face, but I felt its gaze piercing into me like it was studying me. The air around me felt colder. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. I instantly regretted it. The figure didn't respond. It didn't move. It just stood there like it was waiting. My gut told me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. Something about the way it stood there made my body freeze in place. I don't know how long I stood there, but it felt like an eternity. Every second, my skin crawled more and more. Finally, I turned around and sprinted back to the road. My breath came out in sharp gasps, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't look back. I didn't care if the figure was still there. I just needed to get away. I reached the car, panting, and jumped inside, slamming the door behind me. I fumbled for the keys and tried the ignition once again. This time, the car sputtered to life. I didn't question it. I just put the car in gear and sped down the road, not daring to look back. The road seemed to stretch on forever, but all I wanted was to get out of there. As I drove, I glanced in my rearview mirror. The headlights barely cut through the fog now, and in the reflection, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The figure, tall, hunched, was standing in the middle of the road, its face still hidden, but I could feel its eyes boring into me even from this distance. I slammed my foot on the gas, speeding away as fast as I could, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town, where I found a small, dimly lit diner that was open 24/7. I pulled into the parking lot, my hands shaking as I stepped out of the car. The diner's bell jingled as I walked inside, and the waitress looked up from behind the counter. I could tell she'd seen her fair share of strange stories, but when I told her what had happened, her face went pale. "You're lucky you made it out of there," she said in a hushed voice, glancing nervously out the window. "That road's been the site of some strange disappearances over the years. People say there's something in those woods, something that doesn't like visitors." I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me, that maybe the woods weren't done with me yet.
Next story.
I don't know if I'll be able to get through this. Honestly, I'm not even sure if I should be telling you this, but I can't get it out of my head. What happened to me out there? It's been haunting me. I hope no one else has to experience something like this, not in the middle of nowhere, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning. I was on a road trip, just me, a car, and the open highway. I needed some time to think, to be alone. I'd been cooped up with work and life, and I felt suffocated. So I packed up my things, jumped in my old sedan, and took off into the vast stretches of rural America, the parts of the country that aren't covered in tourist traps or flashing billboards. Just the quiet, the solitude. I felt free, like I could breathe for the first time in ages. The sun was setting as I cruised through the flatlands of Nebraska, the endless fields stretching in every direction. There was something peaceful about it, but something eerie too. I passed by the occasional farm or rundown gas station, but they were few and far between. I wasn't really paying attention to the time or my surroundings. I was too lost in my own thoughts. At some point, the road became narrower, less traveled. The pavement started to crack, and the signs became fewer. I didn't think much of it, assuming it was just another rural highway that led to nowhere. But then, I saw it. A small wooden sign with peeling paint, swaying in the wind, popped up from the side of the road. The letters were faint, but I could just make out Wells Hollow. I didn't know what kind of town that was, or if it was even a town at all, but curiosity got the better of me. Maybe I'd find a place to stop, maybe a diner or a motel. So I took the turn. The road immediately became even less maintained, and the trees on either side grew taller and denser, closing in like a tunnel. I wasn't sure if I was still on a public road, or if I had just wandered onto someone's private property. But, like I said, I wasn't really thinking straight. The day was slipping into darkness, and I figured I'd find somewhere to stay soon enough. I drove for what felt like an eternity, the only sounds being the hum of my engine and the occasional screech of tires on the deteriorating asphalt. The only signs of life were a few distant houses, their lights barely visible through the thick trees. But nothing in Wells Hollow seemed to be alive. There was no welcoming glow of street lamps, no neon lights, no busy trucks. It was just stillness. Eventually, I came across an old gas station. The roof was sagging, and the pumps looked like they hadn't been used in years. There was no one in sight. I parked my car and stepped out, feeling the chill of the evening air biting at my skin. The wind whispered through the trees, and I could hear what sounded like faint laughter. The kind of laugh that's too distant to make sense of, but somehow feels wrong. I shivered and walked towards the dilapidated station, thinking maybe I could ask the person inside where I could find a place to stay. The door creaked loudly as I pulled it open, and I stepped inside. The inside smelled like dust and old coffee, and the dim light from a single bulb overhead barely illuminated the room. There was no one behind the counter. Just a few rows of expired snacks and a fridge filled with drinks that probably shouldn't have been sold to anyone. I called out, "Hello?" Nothing. No answer. At this point, I was starting to feel uneasy. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't welcome here, like something about the place didn't sit right with me. But I was so far from civilization at that point, and I didn't want to risk driving further into the night, so I figured I'd wait for a moment and see if anyone came out. As I stood there, glancing around the gas station, I noticed something strange, a set of old photographs pinned to the corkboard on the wall. They were faded, some of them torn at the edges, and they all seemed to depict the same old building, the gas station, from different decades. But in each one, there was one constant. People, faces staring directly into the camera. No smiles, no warmth, just cold, empty eyes. The faces looked wrong. Something in their expressions made me feel uneasy, like they were watching me. A movement outside caught my attention. I turned to look through the window, and that's when I saw them. Figures moving in the distance, at the edge of the tree line, almost like they were lurking just out of sight. It was too far away to make out any detail, but they were unmistakably human. I'm not sure what it was, but something about the way they moved, it was like they weren't walking naturally. They moved in jerky, erratic motions, like they were being pulled by some unseen force. They didn't seem to notice me, or if they did, they didn't care. I froze, unsure of what to do. I quickly stepped back from the window, my heart pounding. Then I heard it. The sound of a voice, soft, whispering, almost like a chant. It came from outside, from somewhere deeper in the woods. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, sinister. I wanted to leave, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with the gas station. I had no choice but to wait it out, to hope that whoever was out there would go away. But the longer I stayed, the more I felt like something was closing in on me, trapping me in this godforsaken place. Minutes passed, maybe even hours. The figures outside seemed to multiply. I could see them now, dozens of them, slowly advancing, moving with that unnatural jerking motion. I felt like I was in a nightmare. And then, just as I thought I might lose my mind, the door behind me slammed open. I spun around, heart racing, expecting to see someone, or something, standing there. But it was just an old man hunched over, his clothes ragged and torn like he'd been living in the woods for years. His eyes were wild, crazed. "I told you not to come here," he rasped, his voice hoarse like he hadn't spoken in days. "This place, it's cursed. They'll take you. You won't leave." I backed away from him, fear coursing through my veins. "Who? What are you talking about?" His eyes darted to the window where I saw the figures in the distance closing in. "The ones who never leave," he muttered. "The ones who died here. They never left." I wanted to scream, but I couldn't make a sound. The whispering from the trees grew louder, and the figures outside began to move faster. They were coming for me. I ran to my car, started the engine, and sped out of there without a second thought. I didn't look back until I was miles away, heart still hammering in my chest, trying to make sense of everything that had just happened. I swear, I could still hear the whispers in my ears. And sometimes when I close my eyes, I can see those empty faces from the photographs staring at me, judging me, as if they know something I don't. I never found out what really happened in Wells Hollow. I couldn't bring myself to go back and find out. I'm telling you this because if you ever find yourself there in the middle of nowhere, don't stop. Don't even think about it. Just keep driving. Because if you don't, if you stop even for a moment, well, you might just become one of them.
Next story.
It was the kind of night that made you feel small. I remember the cold like it was yesterday. The kind of cold that sinks into your bones and refuses to leave. I was driving alone, miles and miles from anywhere, down a stretch of highway so desolate it might as well have been forgotten by time itself. I'd been on the road for hours, the landscape a blur of dark fields and twisted trees, when I started noticing something strange. It started as a flicker, just a hint of movement out of the corner of my eye, like something was keeping pace with my car. At first, I thought it was just my tired mind playing tricks on me. But it didn't stop. The feeling, the sense that something was following me, something out there in the dark, grew stronger. Every time I looked over my shoulder, I saw nothing, just the endless stretch of empty road. But the unease stayed with me, pressing against my chest like a heavy weight. I should have turned back, but I didn't. I thought of the motel I was headed to, a tiny place I'd found online when I'd planned the trip. I'd been driving for hours, desperate for sleep. A warm bed was just within reach, or so I told myself. The wind started picking up, howling around the car, and the radio, which had been playing static for miles, suddenly blared to life with a shrill, high-pitched noise that made my head throb. The signal was cutting in and out, but I could swear I heard someone whispering through the static. It wasn't words, just a voice, low, distorted, like it was coming from somewhere deep underground. My fingers trembled as I turned the volume down, but the voice seemed to follow me, fading in and out as if it were part of the very air. That's when I saw the sign. It was faded, barely legible, but it still caught my eye. Blackwater Road, 5 miles. The motel wasn't far now, but the sign, something about it, set my nerves on edge. I had never heard of Blackwater Road before, and as I looked up again, I noticed the headlights were casting shadows that didn't quite line up with the surroundings. The trees on either side of the road seemed to bend in unnatural ways, their branches reaching toward me like claws. My foot pressed harder on the gas pedal, trying to outrun the growing feeling of dread. I wanted to believe it was nothing more than exhaustion, that I was imagining things. But the darkness was too thick here, too oppressive. It felt like it was closing in on me. The miles dragged on. Every turn seemed to lead deeper into some unknown territory. The road was narrow, surrounded by woods that grew taller and thicker the further I drove. The air was thick, moist, and every now and then I'd catch a glimpse of something, just out of reach, moving in the trees. I thought it was animals at first, but there was something about the way they moved that made my stomach twist. Too fluid, too fast. I came upon another sign, this one fresh and new, as if someone had just put it up. Blackwater Motel, 1 mile. Relief washed over me. I'd made it. The lights of the motel appeared in the distance, flickering through the trees, and I exhaled, barely aware of how tense I had been. When I pulled into the parking lot, the place looked exactly like the rundown motels you see in horror films. Dimly lit, old-fashioned, with peeling paint and rusty signs. The lights flickered, casting eerie shadows that stretched out like they were alive. I parked under the flickering streetlight and stepped out of the car, my breath coming out in white puffs in the cold air. I stood there for a moment, taking it all in. There was a strange stillness here, a silence that felt too thick, like the place was holding its breath. The motel's office door creaked open, and a man stepped out. He looked like someone who belonged to the past, with his graying hair and a face weathered by time. His clothes were out of place, too, like he'd stepped out of another era entirely. "You need a room?" he asked, his voice rough, like he hadn't spoken in years. I nodded, a little shaken. "Just for the night," I said, and he handed me a key. "The last room," he added. "Room 13. I didn't think much of it at the time. Room 13 is a cliché, right? I smiled weakly and thanked him before heading to my room. The hallway was narrow and dark, the carpet threadbare and stained. The air inside smelled old, like dust and something else, something rancid. I pushed the door open and immediately the temperature dropped. It felt like stepping into a tomb. The lights flickered as I walked in, the bulb buzzing faintly above my head. I tossed my bag on the bed and sat down, trying to shake off the growing sense of unease. I tried to watch TV, but the screen was fuzzy, the channel shifting from static to strange images that made my stomach churn. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch, grow, as if the very walls were alive, pressing in on me. I reached for the remote, trying to change the channel, but that's when I heard it. A tapping. Light, rhythmic tapping, coming from somewhere above me. I froze, listening. It wasn't a normal sound, like someone walking or something shifting. It was deliberate, methodical. Tap, tap, tap. My pulse quickened. I told myself it was just the plumbing, the house settling. But the longer I listened, the more it felt like something, was up there with me. I tried to push it out of my mind. I turned the volume up on the TV, but it didn't help. The tapping continued, louder now, closer, almost like it was coming from right above me. I stood up, my hands shaking, and grabbed the door handle. Maybe I could ask the man for an explanation. But the moment I opened the door, I saw something that froze me to my core. The hallway was empty, except for the man. He was standing at the far end, facing the wall. His back was to me, but I could see him clearly, his shoulders hunched, his hands clasped in front of him. He didn't move, didn't even seem to breathe. The moment our eyes met, he turned slowly, deliberately, and without a word began to walk toward me. I tried to slam the door, but my hand went right through the knob, as if it wasn't even there. I stumbled back, my heart racing as the man approached. But as he got closer, I realized something was terribly wrong. His eyes, empty, hollow. There was no life in them, only an endless black void. The tapping, now louder, faster, came from all around me, coming from the walls, the ceiling, the floor. It was as if the very building was trying to claw its way into my mind. I backed away from the door, but I couldn't escape. It was like I was stuck in a dream I couldn't wake up from. The man was right in front of me now, and he raised his hand, slow and deliberate. The air felt thick with dread. My body refused to move, my legs frozen in place. And then I heard the whispers, rising from the walls, from the ground beneath me. Soft at first, but growing louder until they filled the entire room. I could make out fragments of words, names, screams, pleas for help. "You shouldn't have come," they hissed. "You're ours now." I don't know how I managed to get out of there. One moment I was standing in that room, paralyzed, and the next I was outside, gasping for air. The motel behind me, nothing but an outline in the distance. The man, the tapping, the whispers, they all faded as I ran, as fast as I could, my heart pounding in my chest. The further I got, the lighter the air became, but I didn't stop until I hit the main road, until I was back in the safety of the world I knew. I never went back to that place. In fact, I never spoke about it again. But the memories, the images of that man, those hollow eyes, the whispers, they follow me even now. And if you ever find yourself on a stretch of road somewhere out in the middle of nowhere and you see a sign for Blackwater Motel, just keep driving.
Next story.
I still remember the night it all happened. It's funny how a single moment can alter the course of your life, how everything can feel normal one minute and then plunge into something unexplainable the next. This story, I wish I could say it was a nightmare, but I know it wasn't. It started with a road trip. It was supposed to be a simple drive across the back roads of Kansas, just me and a buddy of mine, Jake. We were both on our way to visit his cousin in a small town called Black Hollow, a place that barely showed up on any map. Jake had grown up there, and though I was hesitant about the place, hearing all sorts of weird stuff about its history, I agreed to go. The drive was uneventful, just endless stretches of flat, barren land, the kind of terrain where nothing exists except for the occasional farm or abandoned house. We were deep in the middle of nowhere, with the closest city a good 2 hours away. Jake had warned me that the town was, well, strange. Not a lot of people ever stopped by. It's just isolated, you know? People keep to themselves. But it's home, he'd said. He didn't seem too bothered by it, but something in the way he spoke made me feel uneasy. As we got closer, the mood shifted. The trees started getting denser, and the air felt thicker, like something was waiting, hiding, just out of sight. We hit Black Hollow right around dusk. The sun was dipping below the horizon, and the town looked like it had been frozen in time. A few old houses, a rundown gas station, and a main street that looked abandoned. The kind of place where people went to disappear. Jake took the wheel and drove us to his cousin's house, which was on the outskirts of town. The house was a large, old Victorian, surrounded by overgrown grass. It looked like something out of an old horror movie. His cousin, Mason, greeted us at the door. He was friendly enough, but gave me the feeling that he knew more than he let on about this place. Something about his eyes seemed too old for his age. We unpacked and settled in. Mason showed us around the house, but the deeper we went inside, the more oppressive it felt. The house had these creaky wooden floors that groaned with every step, and the air felt thick with dust like it hadn't been disturbed in years. Still, we shrugged it off and went on with our evening, sitting around the kitchen table drinking beer and telling stories. It was Mason who told us the first story. He'd been quiet for a while, watching us before he suddenly spoke. "You guys know about the Hollow, right?" We both stared at him. "What do you mean? The town?" I asked. "No. The Hollow," he said, lowering his voice. "It's not just the town. It's the land. You don't go out there at night, especially when it's dark." Jake chuckled nervously, but Mason's eyes didn't waver. "You don't get it," he continued. "The place has history. People used to live out there before the town was founded. Long before. But it wasn't just people. There were things that don't belong." I was about to laugh it off, but something in Mason's voice made me pause. There was a heaviness in his words, a sense of warning. He went on to tell us about the local legends. People had gone missing, bodies had been found, strange noises heard late at night. The deeper into the Hollow you went, the stranger things got. The locals didn't talk about it much, but those who'd lived here long enough knew better than to ignore it. "We don't go out there at night. It's bad enough as it is during the day," Mason said, locking eyes with both of us. Just don't. Don't go into the hollow." I could tell he wasn't joking, but by then, Jake and I were already a few beers in, and we just brushed it off as one of those local tall tales. I wasn't worried. Not yet. Later that evening, after the beers had run out and the house had gone eerily quiet, I went up to the guest room where Jake and I were supposed to sleep. I was alone for a moment, standing in the hallway, when I heard something strange, a faint sound, almost like a whisper, coming from the direction of the attic. I froze. It was so quiet in the house, but this sound, it was unmistakable. I shook my head, dismissing it. The house was old, probably the wind or the house settling. But the longer I stood there, the more the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Something felt off, like I wasn't supposed to be there. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching me. I hurried to the room, shut the door, and tried to sleep. The next morning, Jake and I decided to take a walk around the town. Mason told us to be careful, warned us not to stray too far into the woods, but we didn't listen. The whole place seemed so deserted, so forgotten, it felt like we had stepped into another time, or perhaps another reality altogether. We ended up walking down the main street, passing old stores with boarded up windows and houses that had long since been abandoned. It was like the town had stopped living a long time ago. As we ventured farther, we reached the edge of town, where the woods began. I wanted to turn back, but Jake was eager to keep going. "Come on, man. We're in the middle of nowhere. This is exactly the kind of place to explore." I couldn't argue with that logic, so we kept walking until we found ourselves standing at the entrance to a narrow trail leading into the dense trees. The air had become thicker, heavier, as if the woods were alive with something that didn't want us there. I felt it then. A growing sense of dread creeping up my spine. Jake led the way, but as we walked deeper into the hollow, the surroundings grew eerily silent. The usual sounds of birds and insects were gone. It felt like we were the only two people on Earth. We kept walking, and then we saw it, an old, dilapidated house, half hidden by the trees. It looked like it had been abandoned for decades, the walls sagging and cracked. The windows were dark, staring at us like empty eyes. Jake, ever the curious one, started walking toward the house. I hesitated, my gut telling me to turn back. But I didn't. We reached the house, and as we stepped inside, I felt an overwhelming sense of wrongness. The air was cold, and the floorboards creaked under our feet. A strange smell lingered in the air, something metallic, like blood. The house seemed to be alive in some way, as if it were waiting for something. Jake was ahead of me, poking around, when he stopped suddenly. I could hear his voice, low, almost trembling. "Do you hear that?" I strained to listen, but all I could hear was the deafening silence. Then, faintly, I heard it. Whispers, soft and unintelligible, coming from upstairs. My heart skipped a beat. There was no one else here, I was sure of it. But the whispers, they were real. Jake motioned for me to follow him. I didn't want to, but I had to. We climbed the creaky stairs, and as we reached the top, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. I could almost make out words, though they didn't make sense. But what I did understand was the feeling. Someone, something, was close. So close. And then we saw it. At the end of the hallway stood a door, half open, a dim light flickering inside. The whispers were coming from there. I took a step forward, but before I could react, the door slammed shut. I froze. My heart was pounding in my chest, and my breathing quickened. I could feel something ancient, something angry behind that door. "Jake," I whispered, "we need to leave. Now." But Jake wasn't listening. He was already walking toward the door, his hand reaching out to open it. "It's just a house, man. There's nothing here." The moment his hand touched the knob, everything went silent. Not a sound. The air grew heavy again, suffocating. Then in the darkness, a figure appeared at the end of the hallway. It was a woman, but not a woman. Her eyes were hollow, dark, and her skin was stretched tight, pale, like it was barely holding on. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. And then before I knew it, we were running through the woods, through the night, not looking back. I don't know how we made it out of there, but we did. We never went back to Black Hollow. And to this day, I don't know what happened in that house, what that thing was. But I know one thing for sure. There's something in those woods. Something ancient and evil waiting for the next person to step into the hollow. If you ever find yourself on a lonely stretch of road somewhere in the middle of nowhere and you feel like something is watching you, don't ignore it. Turn around, turn back, and never go into the hollow.
Next story.
It started as a simple trip, just a weekend away to disconnect. At least, that's how I tried to convince myself. But deep down, I knew there was something different about this place. Something about the way my brother Scott spoke about it when he invited me. It was just a cabin in the woods, far off from the nearest town. He said it was secluded and quiet, which is exactly what I needed after everything that had happened back home. At first, it seemed harmless enough. I arrived at the cabin late Friday afternoon. The sun was still up, casting a golden glow over the dense woods surrounding the place. It was peaceful, isolated. But as soon as I stepped inside, I felt it. The air was thick, heavy, and the silence was unnerving. No birds, no rustling leaves, nothing. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath. Scott was already there when I arrived, sitting by the fire pit outside. He greeted me with a big smile and a beer, but his eyes were different. They looked distant, like he was staring at something far off in the distance. I chalked it up to the exhaustion of the drive and the general stress of life. We hadn't seen each other in a few months, and I figured I'd get him to loosen up once we were settled. "Come on, let's get inside. We've got a couple days to ourselves," he said, motioning for me to follow. I nodded and stepped inside the cabin, immediately noticing how cramped and dark it felt, despite the sunlight trying to peek through the small windows. The interior was simple, but the walls had an odd pattern to them. Not exactly wallpaper, but something off. I couldn't quite place it, but something about the patterns made me uncomfortable. "This place been in the family for a while?" I asked, trying to make conversation. Scott chuckled, but didn't look at me directly. "Yeah, it's been in the family for generations. Grandpa used to come here all the time. It's got some history." I didn't press further. I didn't want to ruin the mood. It wasn't until that night that things started to get strange. We had dinner, burgers on the grill, and after, we sat outside by the fire, drinking beers and talking about the good old days. Scott seemed like his usual self, a bit withdrawn but still engaged in conversation. The fire crackled, casting long shadows across the yard, but something about the shadows didn't look right. I didn't say anything at first. Maybe it was the alcohol or the fatigue from the drive, but every now and then I'd glance at the trees at the edge of the property and see something flicker. A shape. Or at least, I thought I did. But when I turned my head to look, there was nothing there. Just the dark outline of the trees. Scott didn't seem to notice anything. He was staring into the fire, almost trance-like, his face expressionless. I kept my gaze fixed on the fire as well, trying to shake the weird feeling that had crept into my bones. Around midnight, we went inside, and Scott excused himself to his room. I couldn't sleep. My mind kept racing, replaying the flickers I thought I saw. I sat up in bed for what felt like hours, trying to make sense of it, but it was like something was calling me, drawing me out of the room. The cabin was eerily quiet. The floorboards creaked under my feet as I walked to the kitchen for some water. That's when I noticed something I hadn't seen before. On the wall, right above the sink, there was an old photograph. It wasn't particularly striking, just a black and white picture of a family standing in front of the cabin, probably from decades ago. But there was something odd about the faces. The woman in the photo had an unnaturally stiff smile, her eyes wide, almost too wide. The man beside her looked the same, frozen in place, like he was trying to hide something. But what really unsettled me were the children. They weren't smiling. Their faces were blank, void of any expression, their eyes dark as if they had seen something they shouldn't have. I stared at the photo for what felt like an eternity. I wasn't sure why, but the longer I looked, the more I felt like they were staring back at me. I shook my head, trying to clear my thoughts. Maybe it was just the eerie quiet of the place getting to me. But then I heard it. A faint scratching sound coming from the hallway just outside the kitchen. I froze. It was soft at first, barely audible, but it grew louder, like something or someone was dragging their nails across the floor. My heart raced. I slowly stepped toward the hallway, not daring to make a sound. The scratching continued, and with each step I took, the sound grew louder. I reached the doorway and stood there, staring into the darkness. The hallway was empty. I let out a sigh of relief, thinking it was just the house settling. But then something moved in the corner of my vision. I turned just in time to see the shadows shift, like a person walking, but there was no one there. My breath caught in my throat. I turned quickly and ran into Scott's room, slamming the door behind me. He was fast asleep, oblivious to the chaos I had just experienced. I shook him awake, my voice trembling. "Scott? Scott, wake up!" He groggily opened his eyes and rubbed his face. "What's going on? What's wrong?" "There's something here," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I heard something, scratching, and I saw something moving. Scott didn't seem concerned. In fact, he looked more annoyed than anything. "You're just freaking yourself out, man. It's nothing." But his eyes were vacant, hollow, like he wasn't really looking at me. "Scott, listen to me." He sat up, his gaze fixed on the door. "There's something wrong with this place. We shouldn't have come." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What are you talking about? You've been here before." He slowly turned his head to face me. His eyes were wide, far too wide, like the woman in the photo. I've seen them. The ones in the photo. They're not just pictures, they're warnings. I couldn't speak. My mind was reeling, my thoughts spiraling. What was he talking about? What did he know? Before I could ask, the scratching noise started again. This time it was louder, closer. It was coming from the walls, from all sides, as though the house itself was alive. And then I heard a voice, low and slow, crawling its way through the air. "You should have never come back." It wasn't Scott's voice. It wasn't anyone's voice I recognized. I scrambled out of bed, heart pounding. "What is that? Who's here?" Scott didn't move. He just stared at the door, his face blank. "They've been waiting for us to come back." I looked around the room, panic rising in my chest. The walls were closing in. I couldn't breathe. Suddenly, the door burst open, and I saw them, figures standing at the threshold, their faces twisted in silent screams, eyes wide and dark, just like the ones in the photo. They stepped forward, their movements jerky, unnatural. Before I could scream, they were on me, pulling me into the darkness of the hallway.
Next story.
I didn't want to go. I should have listened to my gut, but we were out there already, miles from anywhere, and I felt obligated. The group of us, we'd been hiking for hours, and it was almost dark by the time we stumbled upon that old shack. It wasn't even a real house, more like a ruined structure that barely stood, a broken-down relic from another time. The walls were crumbling, and the roof had caved in on one side, but it had a certain allure to it, like it had stories to tell. I'm sure you've heard the saying, "Never go off the beaten path." Well, we didn't listen. It was supposed to be a fun weekend camping trip in the mountains, a way to disconnect and escape from the chaos of our daily lives. I had no idea what we were walking into when we found the shack. We had been on the trail for hours when we saw it from a distance, barely visible through the trees. We were all tired and ready to rest, so it seemed like a good spot to stop. My friends, Derek, Emily, and John, were all eager to explore. I wasn't sure at first. The place just gave me the creeps. I don't know why. There was something about the silence around it, something that felt wrong. Derek, ever the adventurous one, was the first to step through the broken doorframe. Come on. It's just an old cabin. You guys are too paranoid, he said with a laugh. We hesitated, but eventually we all followed him inside. The inside was dark, even though the sun hadn't completely set yet. The light barely made it through the dusty windows, and the smell of mold and decay hit us as we stepped over the threshold. The floorboards creaked with every move, and the walls were covered in strange marks, scrawls and symbols that seemed out of place. Not your typical graffiti, but something older, as if they had been carved into the wood long ago. Emily ran her hand along the wall, her fingers brushing against the symbols. "What do you think these mean?" she asked, her voice hushed. "I don't know," I said, "but I don't think we should stick around long enough to figure it out." But no one was listening to me. John was already poking around the corners, and Derek was investigating a rusty old stove. "It's fine," he said, grinning. "Look at this place. It's abandoned. No one's been here for years." I didn't feel so sure. There was a weight to the air, a heaviness that seemed to settle around us. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but there was nothing but the eerie quiet. The kind of quiet you get when something's off. That's when I noticed something strange on the floor. It was a pile of dirt mixed with leaves and broken glass near the far corner of the room. But there was something else buried under it, something hard and shiny. I bent down to get a closer look and saw it. A metal key. Old, rusted, but unmistakable. "Hey, look at this," I called out to the group. They all gathered around me, their faces lit by the faint glow of the dying light. Derek knelt beside me and picked up the key. "What do you think it opens?" he asked with a teasing smile, but the humor didn't reach his eyes. "I don't know, man," I muttered, "but I'm getting a bad feeling about this." "Are you scared of a key?" Emily laughed, nudging me. "It's just a key, nothing else." But I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. And I wasn't talking about the group. No, it was something else. Something in the walls, the air, the very foundation of that shack. The silence stretched on longer than it should have. We were all too tense, staring at that key as if it held the answer to some forgotten riddle. Finally, John spoke up, his voice low. "Let's just leave the key here. No need to get involved in whatever this place is about." Derek, however, was still eyeing it with curiosity. "It's probably nothing," he said. "But let's see where it goes. I'm sure it opens something. Let's look around." Against my better judgment, I followed them. But I stayed at the back of the group. The air in that place was thick, and the shadows stretched unnaturally long as the sun set completely behind the mountains. I didn't feel safe, not anymore. We checked the other rooms in the shack, but they were all empty, devoid of any furniture or belongings. It was just a hollow shell of a building, but it seemed to be hiding something. The key felt heavier and heavier in Derek's hand, like it was guiding him toward something, pulling him in. Then we found it. A door. It was tucked away at the back of the shack, covered by a sheet of rotting wood. The door itself was ancient, the wood worn and scarred, with more of those strange symbols carved into it, just like on the walls. Derek wasted no time and shoved the key into the lock. The sound of the metal turning echoed through the room, and I swear the temperature dropped when that door creaked open. The room behind it was pitch black. At first, I thought it was just another empty space, but then I noticed something. A faint glow coming from deep inside. It was a cold blue light, pulsating like a heartbeat. There was something in there, something alive, but not alive in the way I understood it. It felt wrong, unnatural. Derek stepped forward, almost in a trance, and that's when it happened. The door slammed shut behind him. The rest of us stood frozen, but the air around us seemed to tighten like a vice. The light behind the door flickered violently, and we heard it. A whisper. Soft at first, but growing louder, distorted, as if it were coming from all around us. Words we couldn't understand, voices speaking in unison, too many to count. Then something reached out from the darkness. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything I could describe. All I know is that it grabbed Derek and pulled him into the darkness. He didn't scream. There was no sound from him at all, just the rustling of something shifting in the dark. Then, silence. Absolute silence. We didn't waste a second. We ran. We didn't look back, didn't stop to think about the horror we had just witnessed. All we wanted was to get out of there. But it was too late. We were already marked. We managed to get out of the shack and back to the trail, but the woods, they weren't the same. Every tree seemed to watch us. The air grew colder with each step. The further we walked, the more the ground beneath us seemed to shift. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following us. When we finally made it to the car, all of us were shaking. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. We knew what we had seen, what we had unleashed. Derek was never found. The authorities scoured the area for days, but there was no sign of him. It was like he had just vanished. But I know the truth. I saw it. I felt it. Whatever that thing was, it didn't want us to leave. And now every time I close my eyes, I see the light, the glow. I hear the whispers. I don't know if it's still out there or if it's following me, but I can feel it. I don't think we'll ever escape what we disturbed in that shack.
Next story.
The night I stumbled into the woods was the night my life changed forever. I was tired. So tired. The kind of exhaustion that's hard to shake, no matter how many hours of sleep you get. I had just finished a long week of work, and I figured a weekend camping trip alone would be a good way to clear my head. I didn't even care about the location. I just wanted peace, quiet, and to escape the noise of the city. I found the campsite on a small, barely maintained road that twisted its way through dense woods. No signs, no markers, just a trailhead and a narrow path leading deeper into the trees. It felt untouched, remote. It felt like the perfect place to get away. The air was fresh when I arrived, the smell of pine and damp earth heavy in my lungs. I set up my tent in a secluded clearing, one that felt just right. Not too close to the trail, but not too far in either. The kind of spot where you feel alone, but not abandoned. The perfect balance. That night, after a simple meal of freeze-dried pasta and a small campfire, I sat back and watched the flames dance in front of me. The night sky above was clear, the stars sharp and bright, and for a while I felt at peace. But peace, it seemed, was a fleeting thing. It started as a rustling sound, faint at first. Just a shift in the wind, I thought. The sound of leaves moving in the breeze. But the noise grew louder and sharper. It wasn't the wind anymore. It was something moving, something heavy. My heart began to race, but I brushed it off. I told myself it was probably an animal, a deer maybe, or even a raccoon. But the longer it went on, the less natural it sounded. It wasn't the usual forest noises. It was deliberate, methodical. I grabbed the flashlight by my side and stood up, shining the beam into the woods. The light cut through the darkness, but it revealed nothing. Only shadows and trees. I told myself to calm down. It was probably just my imagination, worn thin by the silence. I sat back down by the fire, trying to steady my breathing. But then I heard it. A voice, a whisper, soft and melodic, but faint. At first I thought I was hearing things, but it was clear now. The voice was coming from the woods, just beyond the reach of the firelight. It was too far to understand, but it sounded like it was calling my name. Lily. I froze. The voice was unmistakable. I knew it. My name. But there was no one out there. No one could be out there. I was alone, wasn't I? I stood up quickly, my mind spinning. I couldn't tell if the voice was real or if I was imagining it, but it was unmistakable. It had to be real. The whisper came again. Lily. My flashlight trembled in my hand as I swung it around the clearing. The shadows stretched long and dark, but there was no one. There was no one, and the voice was gone. The wind picked up again, rustling the trees, but it wasn't the wind. It was a movement, not from nature, but something else. I should have packed up and left right then, but I didn't. Instead, I grabbed my things and stepped away from the fire, walking toward the edge of the woods where the voice had come from. Maybe I could find whoever was out there. Maybe it was just someone lost or trying to play a prank. But the moment I stepped into the woods, everything changed. The air felt thick, heavy, with an unseen pressure. It was suddenly darker, despite the light from the moon filtering through the trees. The path was uneven, the forest floor uneven beneath my boots. I could still hear the rustling in the distance, but the sound felt closer now, as if something was following me. I quickened my pace, telling myself I was just being paranoid. Maybe it was an animal after all, or maybe my mind was playing tricks. But then I heard it again. The whisper. It was louder this time. Lily. I stopped dead in my tracks. The voice was unmistakable now, like someone was standing right behind me, just out of sight. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as I slowly turned around, my flashlight trembling in my hand. I was expecting to see someone, something. But all I saw was darkness, the forest closing in around me. The rustling grew louder, and then, without warning, a shape darted across the path in front of me. It was too fast to make out, just a blur of motion. I screamed, my heart pounding in my chest. The voice, the whispering, it was everywhere now. I couldn't tell where it was coming from. It was as if the very trees themselves were calling to me. Lily? I spun around again, and that's when I saw it. A figure standing between the trees, just out of the light's reach. It was tall, thin, and seemed to blend with the shadows. I couldn't make out any features, only the shape. But I felt it watching me, staring at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I backed away, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The whispering grew louder, swirling around me, filling my ears with those two syllables. My name. Lily? I stumbled backward, my hands reaching out to steady myself. The darkness was closing in, the trees tightening around me, as if the forest itself was alive, drawing me in. My heart was pounding in my ears, and I could barely hear my own thoughts over the voice that echoed through the woods. I had to get out. I had to leave. But when I turned to run, my foot caught on something, a root, a rock I didn't know, and I fell hard to the ground. The last thing I saw before I blacked out was the figure standing at the edge of the trees, moving closer, its shape growing clearer, its eyes two deep, black pits of nothingness staring straight at me. When I woke up, it was morning. The sunlight filtered weakly through the trees, and the clearing around me seemed normal, almost peaceful. But I knew something had changed. I made it back to the campsite. My tent was still standing, my gear undisturbed, but there was something different about it now. The air felt colder, emptier, and I could feel the forest watching me. I packed up in a daze, shaking with adrenaline and fear. As I walked back to my car, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that something had followed me out of the woods. I drove away quickly, never looking back, but in the corner of my eye, I swear I saw it, standing between the trees, waiting. The figure from the night before, its eyes staring at me, even from a distance. It's been a few weeks since that night, but I haven't been able to sleep properly since, and sometimes when I'm alone, I hear it, that voice calling my name from the darkness. Lily.
Next story.
It was supposed to be a short road trip. Just a quick detour on the way to a friend's wedding, something to break up the monotony of the drive. At least, that's how it started. I was alone, driving through the endless stretch of empty roads that cut through the backwoods of Kentucky. I had to admit, it was a little eerie. Everything felt so isolated out there. The trees were dense, casting long shadows even in the middle of the day. The towns were sparse and small, each one more rundown than the last. It had been a couple hours since I'd passed the last real gas station, and my fuel gauge was dropping faster than I expected. I was already running late, and now I was starting to worry about running out of gas altogether. That's when I saw it, a small, weathered sign just off the road. It was so faded that I almost missed it, but the words "gas station 1 mile" caught my eye just in time. I sighed in relief and decided to take the exit, hoping it was still open. I didn't have much choice. The road leading to the station was narrow and winding, but eventually I came across a small, dilapidated gas station. It looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. The station was run down, the paint peeling off the walls, the gas pumps rusty and old. There was no sign of life. No cars, no people. It was eerily quiet. I pulled up to one of the pumps, hoping the station would have at least some fuel left. I had a sinking feeling in my gut, but I pushed it aside. I needed gas, and this was my only option. As I stepped out of the car, I noticed a man standing by the door of the small, rundown station building. He was tall, his clothes ragged and faded, his face weathered by time. He didn't look at me at first, just stared off into the distance, lost in his own thoughts. "Hey, you open?" I called out, trying to get his attention. His head snapped around, and I froze. His eyes were pale, almost white, and seemed to glow in the dim light, like they didn't belong to a man at all. I couldn't quite place it, but there was something about him that felt wrong. He stared at me for a long moment, then slowly nodded. "Yeah, you need gas?" I nodded, trying to brush off the discomfort building in me. "Yeah, just need a fill-up." He moved slowly, like his every action was deliberate, and stepped toward the pump. His voice was rough, almost like he hadn't spoken in years. "You're a long way from anywhere. Got any idea where you're headed?" I hesitated, unsure what to say. "Just passing through, on my way to a wedding." The man gave a slight smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Not much here. You should be careful." "Careful?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. His smile faded and his gaze drifted over my shoulder, looking toward the woods behind the station. "There's nothing out here but the road, and the road is never kind to strangers." I felt a shiver run down my spine. "What do you mean?" He didn't respond, just started to pump the gas. The nozzle clicked and he glanced back at me, still smiling faintly. "You shouldn't stay too long. Best to get on your way before nightfall." Something about his words stuck with me, but I tried to shake it off. I paid him, grabbed my receipt, and got back in the car. My hands were trembling slightly, but I didn't know why. I had gas now, and that was all I needed. Right? As I drove away from the station, I glanced at my rearview mirror. The man was still standing by the pump, watching me leave. His eyes never left the car, and the smile never disappeared from his face. The road behind me stretched on, empty and lonely. I kept my eyes forward, trying not to think about the strange encounter. But no matter how hard I tried to shake it off, something gnawed at me. That station, that man, there was something about it that didn't sit right. I drove on, the road stretching endlessly before me. I passed a few more dilapidated buildings, but there was nothing else for miles. and then it started. At first, I thought it was my mind playing tricks on me. I kept hearing a sound, a low, eerie hum, coming from the woods beside the road. It was faint at first, like the wind, but then it grew louder, like something was moving, something large, just out of sight. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I turned my radio up to drown out the noise, but it didn't help. The hum was still there, pressing in, just under the music, almost as if it was syncing with the rhythm of the static. I glanced out the window, heart pounding. The trees looked different now, darker, thicker, and in the distance, I could swear I saw shadows moving just inside the forest, flitting between the trunks. My hands tightened around the steering wheel. That's when I noticed something else. The road was no longer the same. It was as if it had changed subtly. The asphalt was cracked and uneven, the white lines faded. But the real difference? The signs. There were no longer any mile markers, no street signs, nothing to tell me how far I'd come or how far I'd left to go. The world outside seemed to be fading, like I was driving into some kind of void. Panic set in. I pressed harder on the gas pedal, but no matter how fast I went, the darkness crept closer. The hum grew louder, almost deafening now. I could feel my pulse in my ears, but I couldn't make it stop. Then, I saw it, another gas station, just up ahead. I couldn't believe it. How was it possible? I had just passed one, hadn't I? But this one looked different. It was glowing faintly, a sickly greenish hue that didn't seem natural. It looked new, too clean. As I approached, my foot slammed the brake pedal. I didn't know why, but I couldn't stop myself from pulling in. As soon as I parked, I heard a door creak open. I turned, and there, standing in the doorway, was the same man. The same pale eyes, the same crooked smile. "Found your way back, didn't you?" he said softly. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. I tried to back out, but the car wouldn't move. The engine sputtered, and the lights flickered. "You shouldn't have turned around," the man said, his voice almost soothing now. "This place, it doesn't let go. You're here now, and that means you're part of it." I screamed as the world around me seemed to collapse, the trees and road blending into darkness. The man's smile stretched wider, and his eyes glowed in the night. The hum grew louder, and then nothing.
Next story.
It was a late evening when I found myself on a long stretch of road in the middle of nowhere. I had been driving for hours, heading to my cousin's farm in rural Ohio. It was supposed to be a relaxing weekend, just me, some quiet time away from the hustle and bustle of the city, and a break from work. But as the sun dipped below the horizon and the twilight faded into an almost oppressive darkness, I began to feel uneasy. I was on a narrow road, surrounded by thick woods on either side, with barely a house or any other signs of civilization in sight. The further I drove, the more isolated it felt. The silence was unnerving, nothing but the hum of the tires on the road and the occasional distant hoot of an owl. No lights from other vehicles, no houses in the distance. It was just me alone on a road that seemed to stretch forever. The only sound was the monotonous hum of my car engine. I reached for the radio, trying to distract myself. Maybe some music would help calm my nerves. But the moment I turned the dial, the radio went completely static. I cursed under my breath and tried again. Static. A cold, eerie feeling washed over me, and for a split second, I thought I heard something faint, almost like whispering voices coming from the speakers. I quickly turned the dial again, desperate to shake the unease. This time, the radio crackled to life. But the music was off. There was only a faint, low hum that seemed to come from all around. My hands tightened around the wheel. I couldn't explain it. It felt wrong, like something was just off, and I couldn't shake the sense that I wasn't alone. I drove for what seemed like an eternity before I saw something in the distance. A light, barely visible, flickering. I wasn't sure if it was a sign of civilization or just some strange reflection, but I figured I should head toward it. Maybe it was a gas station or a farmhouse where I could stop and ask for directions. As I got closer, the light grew clearer. It was coming from a small shack on the side of the road, the kind you might see on a deserted highway. It was run down, barely standing, with cracked windows and a rotting wooden sign hanging crookedly from the front. But it was a light. I slowed the car down, stopping at the edge of the property. There were no other vehicles parked around, and the shack looked empty. But there was a strange chill in the air now, like the temperature had dropped by several degrees in just a few seconds. I sat in my car for a moment, debating whether or not to get out. Something didn't sit right with me, but curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed a flashlight from the glove compartment and stepped out of the car, my boots crunching on the gravel beneath my feet. The shack's door was slightly ajar. I hesitated for a moment, but then I pushed it open, the creaking sound echoing in the stillness. Inside, there was an odd smell, like old wood and something else I couldn't quite place, something metallic. I shone my flashlight around. The place was a mess. Papers scattered everywhere, shelves of empty jars, a table covered in what looked like old maps. But what really caught my attention was the wall. On one side of the shack, scrawled in what looked like charcoal, were strange symbols. I didn't recognize them, but they were unsettling, too intricate and deliberate to be random scribblings. I took a step closer, shining the flashlight on the symbols, when something moved in the corner of my eye. I spun around quickly, my breath catching in my throat. It was a figure standing at the far end of the shack. I couldn't see its face, but its silhouette was tall and thin, and it stood perfectly still, watching me. I froze. My heart raced as I struggled to make sense of what I was seeing. I didn't know what it was, but I knew one thing: it wasn't human. The figure took a slow step toward me, and I felt a sudden, intense pressure in the air, like the room had become suffocatingly heavy. I backed up slowly, my mind screaming at me to run, but my legs felt like they were glued to the floor. Then, in a voice that was barely a whisper, the figure spoke. "You shouldn't have come here." The words sent a shiver down my spine. I had no idea who or what it was, but I had no intention of finding out. My legs finally moved, and I turned, bolting toward the door. But as I reached for the handle, the door slammed shut on its own with a deafening bang. I spun around, panicking. The figure was closer now, its shape becoming clearer, and I could see its eyes, pale, milky, and hollow. It was as though it didn't have a face, just empty sockets staring into me, and it was so close now I could hear its slow, uneven breathing. Without thinking, I grabbed a nearby chair and threw it at the figure. It passed right through it, like the figure wasn't even there, and I knew right then that I wasn't dealing with something natural. I pounded on the door, but it wouldn't budge. The room was getting colder, and I could feel something pressing down on me, the air thick with tension. Then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of a creaking floorboard behind me. I didn't turn around. I didn't need to. The presence behind me was enough. There was something else in the shack, something I had yet to see, something waiting. I didn't wait to find out what it was. I threw myself against the door again, this time with all my strength, and it finally gave way. I stumbled out onto the gravel, heart pounding in my chest. I didn't look back as I ran to my car. I didn't care if the door was open or the keys were still inside. I jumped in, started the engine, and floored the gas. My mind was racing, heart thudding in my ears as I sped away from that place. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town, my hands still shaking from what I'd just experienced. But when I told people about what happened, they just stared at me blankly, as if they'd heard it before. It wasn't until later that I found out the truth. That shack had a history, an old, forgotten history tied to local legends, a place that had been abandoned for years, but never truly empty. People who went there never returned. And the figure, well, it wasn't the first time someone had seen it, and it wouldn't be the last.
Next story.
I never believed in ghosts. Never. I had always thought those kinds of stories were just for people who were easily frightened. Rational. Logical. That was me. I was the kind of person who thought everything could be explained with a little science, a little research, and maybe some common sense. But that was before I ended up on that road. It had been a long day. I had spent the afternoon visiting some relatives in the city, and I was driving home late at night. The highway I was on was quiet, the kind of road where you could hear your own thoughts if you weren't careful. The air was thick with fog, hanging heavy like a blanket over everything. The headlights of my car only cut through it for a few feet, and everything beyond that was a swirling mystery. It was around 1 a.m. when I noticed it. A car pulled off to the side of the road. Not unusual. There are always cars parked by the side of highways, either broken down or in need of some kind of roadside assistance. But there was something strange about this one. The car was old. Really old. It looked like it hadn't moved in years, its paint faded and peeling, windows cracked and covered in dust. It was out of place, and it was just sitting there. I slowed down, my curiosity getting the best of me. I wasn't sure why, but I felt an odd pull toward it. Maybe it was just the isolation, the eerie silence that had settled in around me. I couldn't explain why, but I decided to stop. I pulled up beside the car and rolled down my window. No one was in the driver's seat, and there didn't seem to be anyone inside at all. The car was completely empty. The engine was off, the headlights dim, and there was an odd smell coming from it, like old leather mixed with something metallic. Something didn't feel right, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I sat there, staring at the car for a few more moments before I decided to drive on. Just as I was about to pull away, I saw something in the rearview mirror. A figure. It was standing beside the car. A person. They were completely still, just standing there, staring at me. I froze. My heart skipped a beat. It was a woman, dressed in an old-fashioned gown, her hair long and dark, falling over her face. But she was standing there in the middle of the night, in the middle of nowhere, as if she had just appeared out of nowhere. I felt a wave of unease flood over me. My instinct told me to leave, to drive away as quickly as possible. But before I could put my foot on the gas, the woman took a step toward my car. I couldn't explain it, but there was something about her. Something that didn't belong in the world I knew. She didn't look like she was alive. She didn't walk like a living person. She glided, her feet barely touching the ground. The air seemed to grow colder the closer she got to me. I should have driven off right then, but my eyes locked with hers. Her gaze was empty, hollow, but there was a sense of urgency in it. She was pleading with me. "Help me," she whispered. It was barely audible, but I heard it clear as day. I froze. My hand gripped the steering wheel tightly, my knuckles turning white. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to drive away, to get out of there, but at the same time, I couldn't bring myself to leave her standing there. "Help me," she repeated, her voice echoing in the quiet night. Something about the way she said it made my blood run cold. The words sounded so desperate, so raw. It was as if she had been calling out for help for so long that it had become a part of her. Before I could even react, she was at my window, her face just inches away from the glass. I could feel her breath fogging up the window, and I could see the pain in her eyes. But there was something else too, something darker, something that didn't belong in this world. And then, in an instant, the entire atmosphere around me shifted. The car felt suffocating, as if the air had thickened, pressing in on me. My car shook slightly, and the engine sputtered as if it was struggling to keep running. The woman's face twisted, her features warping into something grotesque. Her eyes turned black, her skin turned a sickly gray, and her mouth twisted into a wide grin, revealing jagged, yellow teeth. I didn't think. I slammed my foot on the gas, peeling away from her, my tires screeching on the asphalt. I glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see her chasing me, but there was nothing. The road behind me was empty. My heart was pounding in my chest as I sped down the highway, adrenaline coursing through my veins. I didn't stop driving until I reached a small town about an hour away. I pulled into the first gas station I could find, my hands trembling as I turned off the engine. I sat there for a moment, collecting myself, trying to calm my racing heart. But when I stepped out of the car, I saw something that made my blood freeze. The gas station attendant, a man in his late 50s, looked up at me as I approached. I couldn't tell if it was just the lighting or if something was wrong with his expression, but his face was ashen, almost pale. "You see her too, didn't you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I felt my stomach drop. "What?" "The woman by the side of the road. She's been around for years. Same car, same place, every night. No one who's ever stopped for her has lived to tell the tale." The words sent a chill down my spine. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. The man just looked at me, his eyes filled with an expression I couldn't quite understand. Sadness, fear, pity. "Don't stop for her," he added softly, as if he had seen it all before. I never drove that road again. In fact, I took a different route home from that day forward. But I still can't shake the feeling of those hollow eyes staring at me through the rearview mirror. And every time I drive through the night, I wonder if she's still out there, waiting for the next driver to stop, waiting for someone to help her. But sometimes I think she doesn't want help at all.